Hi Year 12, welcome to Standard English Module A, Language, Identity and Culture, where we study 6 poems from contemporary Asian Australian poets. In this module, we're really considering the role of language. Language has the power to both reflect and shape individual and collective identity. Language is a subject within the poem and it's also an influence. It's a theme of each of these poems, and we're going to see that the choices that the composers make are used to really grapple with and reflect who they are as people and who they belong to in terms of a collective identity, as a community. So, how does language define our identity? Are questions posed by these poems. How can language be used to broaden and to limit our understanding of culture? What is the role of one's first language in defining experience? Because we each are unique in our use of language, each mode of expression is individual to us and nuanced. But language also has limitations in this module, where the poets are grappling with using a second language to define experiences and to come to their understanding of their own identity. Let's consider how we respond to the module. Of course, we need to take into account the context. These Asian Australian poets have their own social context and they're part of their own cultural group, but also members of the broader Australian society. Indeed, they bring with them historical experiences. We have poems that refer to the Vietnam War and the ancient cultures of China, for example. And we also have a literary context of poetry, which comes with it stylised ways of composing, such as questions around form. Do we use free verse poetry? What kinds of images are used and repeated? And these impacts of the form and the context influence these poems. And they also influence our ways of responding to these texts. These poets use the poetic form to affirm our assumptions and beliefs about unique experiences and what we might share. Sometimes they ignore responders' assumptions and beliefs around Asian Australians and pose the view that we all share experiences such as food and life and death that unite us and bring us together. These composers reveal our assumptions and beliefs, so some of them are exposing Australian values. Sometimes we have pushes to challenge our assumptions and our stereotypes of Asians and therefore disrupt our view of what we consider to be acceptable, normal, or common experiences. So, if we're talking about language, identity, and culture, what is culture? Is it learned and is it specific to a group or category? Most of these experiences are individually, uniquely expressed in the poem. So, personality refers to the self, and an understanding of the self is questioned in these poems, while unique human experiences are processed and internalised. These are the unique features not shared with anyone else. In the rubric, it says that we also consider the impact texts have on shaping a sense of identity for individuals and communities. Learned aspects of culture can influence how we see the world, and cultural influences on an individual are learned. These are based on language, national, and geographic divisions and expressed through interactions, food, ritual, and reflect shared values about family and community. The poetry that we are going to be reading and studying in our module is influenced by a geopolitical context. The European view of the world versus Eastern traditions are represented in these poems. The national context is hinted at, the legacy of the White Australia policy, where Asian migration to Australia was limited up until after World War II, even though we had many Asian Australians living in our country. The people who write our poems, our poets, are also responding to stereotypes of Asian Australians. The post-colonial context explores the tension between writing in one's second language and the ways that power has been used to limit or suppress those outside the European Western tradition. Our Australian context reflects increased Asian migration, which has led to an increased examination of Australian identity, and considerations around, for a society to be truly inclusive, it needs to reflect a diversity of cultures. And here we're referring to multiculturalism, which reflects the ideas that diversity of culture can enrich the lives of the rest of society. Values and ways of seeing the world broaden the horizons of the dominant culture. So it would be impossible to get a great coffee in Wollongong without the contribution of the Italian community, for example. But it goes just beyond food. It goes down to ways that we see the world. I'm sorry, that's repeated. Circular breathing is set in Rome, juxtaposing the views of the Eastern versus Western views of civilization. Home, by Miriam Weiwei Low, explores the nature of homes and the contrast between one's place of origin and the new place. And in the post-colonial context, Mother operates against the backdrop of the Vietnam conflict, examining the past and present experience of family that has ultimately defined her own identity between two worlds. So we consider the language ideas that we posed at the beginning of this discussion, how it can be used to limit our understanding of culture, how it can expand our understanding of culture, the interplay between languages. How does the poet's past experience limit their cultural space and liminal space? When you're living between two worlds, you might neither be fully in the Asian or in the Australian world. How does culture impact on the more elemental concerns regarding childhood, myth, memory, and collective identity? So, students study one prescribed text in detail, as well as a range of textual material to explore, analyse, and assess the ways in which meaning about individual and community identity, as well as cultural perspectives, is shaped in and through text. Let's unpack that huge sentence from the rubric description. Language shapes and affects our identity. The language choices available to the poet shapes the ideas they are able to express and the ways these are said. Language shapes thinking, and language is power, are all implied in that statement. Language shapes and affects our collective identity, and the language choices available to the poet shapes the cultural perspectives reflected in the text. So it's both personal and communal in the reflections. Poetry is an act of representation, and we're going to be seeing some common ideas across the module. Many of the poems reflect the yearning for self-expression. How can the act of writing refine a sense of self? And how can language be used to limit our understanding of culture? An explosion of light, a word that is itself, a word to possess me, an image so bright and complete, it can only be seen with eyes shut tight, as in prayer. Another common idea is that language memories are connected to a sense of self, that these early memories create an understanding of who we are and how individuals can interact in the world. A speaker's first language is uniquely expressive and culturally nuanced, and there is no mistake that one's first language is called the mother tongue. Melinda Bobbis explores this in This Is Where It Begins. I am 6 years old, perhaps 5. Grandmother is storytelling about the crab stealer hiding under the bed. Each story word crackles under the ghost's teeth. Infernal under my skin. I shiver. So both of these poems, dealing with memory and story and language, see that intertwined, forming an understanding of who each poet is. The search for a place to call home is pretty common in the migrant experience. Coming to a new place so totally different from your past one must force an inner examination and also perspectives about the community that you're coming to. How does language limit chances to feel truly connected to place and community? In Translucent Jade, the poet asks, do I to it belong? The translucent, slowly yielding music, Chinese name. So this search for a place and naming are fairly central to these poems. Other ideas reflect the cultural stereotyping at work as part of an East-West divide. How does language limit our chance to feel truly connected to place and community? Wang Yu writes, P from Wuji spoke of once travelling down a street in Melbourne. I'd never heard of that. It's called Nichusen Street. And playfully mimicking the mispronunciations made by the Chinese community that limit their chance to feel truly connected to that place. Some common literary tropes we're going to see are those we see at work in what we call post-colonial poetry, which often explores the power of naming, what it is to inherit a name, and what are the words that we use to name the things around us. The desire to find a place in which to feel connection. The role of the old and new landscape in order to find a sense of self. And we see in many of the poems a lot of nature imagery and reclaiming the past and combining those aspects of nature that are symbolically important to each poet. The relationship between younger and older generations in passing on culture. An attempt to grapple with continuity across time, with a disruption and understanding of history and the transportation to a new place. How do you understand the impact of your history in your old country, in your present life? And a resistance to categorisation and stereotyping. Nobody wants to be put into a box and to be seen as typical. So exploring what makes us unique and different is in place in many of these poems. And I'd mentioned before an attempt to understand the impact of historical events on self and community. In our prescriptions, it says they investigate how textual forms and conventions, as well as language structures and features, are used to communicate information, ideas, values and attitudes which inform and influence perceptions of ourselves and other people and various cultural perspectives. How do we respond to each poet's exploration? How do we see their ideas at work in our own lives, at work in our family, and in our community more broadly? Some HSC sample questions that we might see are some statements such as the role of language is powerful in representing the cultural worlds in which we live. To what extent do we see that at work in the set texts? How has your understanding of the unique role of language been enhanced through your study of the module? And when language is used in the poetic form to explore the self, a greater cultural understanding is made possible. Unique experiences are represented in each of these poems. To what extent are these poems at once personal but also cultural? So thank you for listening, everybody. I hope that through this overview, you've got a better understanding of the commonality between our poems, the scope of the module, and our purpose for studying it.